It starts with a question that feels almost too uncomfortable to ask out loud. What if some of the biggest names in entertainment didn't fall off on their own? What if they were quietly pushed out the moment they said something they weren't supposed to say? The video pulls you in by placing two names side by side, Wendy Williams and Katt Williams. At first glance, they don't seem connected. Different careers, different styles, different audiences. But the deeper you look, the more the similarities begin to surface. Both of them spoke openly. Both of them challenged powerful figures. And both of them, almost predictably, ended up being labeled in ways that made the public question their credibility. The narrator slowly builds that tension, suggesting that this might not be random at all. Instead, it feels like a pattern, one that repeats itself whenever someone refuses to stay quiet. And just as you begin to process that idea, the story shifts, because understanding Katt Williams might be the key to understanding everything else. The focus tightens on Katt Williams, and the tone becomes more personal, almost like you're being let in on something you weren't supposed to hear. He wasn't just another comedian trying to make it big. He was someone who had already seen behind the curtain. According to his own words, he was approached with offers that most people would never turn down. Massive opportunities, career-defining roles, and access to a level of fame that could secure his legacy forever. But there was always something attached to those offers, something unspoken, yet clearly understood. The narrator explains how Katt recognized that these weren't just career moves, they were tests of compliance. And instead of accepting, he walked away. That single decision marked the beginning of a shift, because in an industry built on influence, refusing to participate doesn't just close doors, it puts a target on your back. And from that moment on, everything about Katt's public image began to change, almost as if the narrative around him was being rewritten in real time. The story then moves into one of the most unsettling moments Katt ever described, an encounter that revealed just how deep the power structure goes. He speaks about being in a room with someone who had near total control over careers, someone whose influence extended far beyond what the public could see. During that meeting, what was offered wasn't just professional advancement. It crossed into something far more disturbing. Actresses presented casually as if they were part of a transaction rather than individuals with agency. The narrator lingers on that detail, emphasizing how normalized this behavior seemed in that environment. It wasn't shocking to them, it was standard. And that realization changes everything, because it suggests that the system isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as intended. Saying no in that moment wasn't just about personal values, it was a direct rejection of how things operate at the highest levels. And as the narrator hints, people who reject that system don't simply walk away unaffected. There are consequences, and those consequences tend to show up in ways the public rarely questions. From there, the narrative expands to include Dave Chappelle, another figure whose story follows a strangely similar path. At the height of his success, he stepped away from a deal that most people couldn't even comprehend turning down. The public reaction was immediate: confusion, disbelief, and eventually suspicion. Headlines began to shift, and the conversation stopped being about his talent or his success and started focusing on his mental state. The narrator carefully frames this transition, pointing out how quickly admiration can turn into doubt when the narrative changes. Chappelle wasn't just walking away from money, he was stepping outside of expectations, and that made him unpredictable. The video suggests that unpredictability is something the industry doesn't tolerate well, because once someone proves they can't be controlled, they become a risk. And the easiest way to neutralize that risk isn't confrontation, it's discrediting them entirely. As this realization settles in, the story circles back to Wendy Williams, where the pattern becomes even harder to ignore. Wendy Williams' situation is presented as both familiar and deeply unsettling. She built her reputation on saying what others wouldn't, speaking openly about topics that many avoided. For years, that boldness was what made her successful. But at some point, the tone shifted. The same behavior that once made her influential suddenly became the reason she was criticized. The narrator walks through how quickly her public image changed, how discussions about her opinions were replaced with discussions about her stability. Diagnoses appeared, restrictions followed, and before long she was no longer in control of her own narrative. The video raises a question without directly answering it. Was this really about her well-being, or was it about removing her voice from the conversation? Because if someone knows too much or says too much, silencing them doesn't always mean making them disappear. Sometimes it just means making sure no one believes them anymore. And that method is far more effective than it seems.
At this point, the narrator steps back and starts connecting the dots, laying out what appears to be a consistent pattern. It doesn't matter who the individual is, comedian, host, actor, the response follows the same structure. First, their credibility is questioned, then their personal life becomes public scrutiny, and finally, their mental state is used as the ultimate explanation for everything. It creates a narrative that feels complete, even if it isn't true. Because once people accept that someone is unstable, they stop listening to what they're actually saying. The video suggests that this isn't accidental, it's strategic, a system designed not just to control behavior, but to control perception. And the most unsettling part is how easily it works. The audience, often without realizing it, becomes part of the process. They consume the headlines, accept the labels, and move on. Meanwhile, the original message, the thing that started it all, gets buried underneath layers of doubt and distraction.
Then the video moves into its most controversial territory, introducing connections that feel almost too extreme to process at first. Names begin to overlap. Situations that once seemed isolated start to look connected. Private flights, exclusive gatherings, relationships between powerful individuals that were never meant to be examined too closely. The narrator doesn't claim certainty, but instead builds a sense of unease, pointing out how often the same figures appear in different contexts. Testimonies, documents, and past reports start to form a larger picture, one that suggests influence extends far beyond what's visible. And while none of it is presented as definitive proof, the accumulation of details becomes difficult to ignore. Because when enough pieces start to align, coincidence becomes harder to believe. The viewer is left in a state of uncertainty, trying to separate what they know from what they're being shown, and realizing that the gap between those two things might be bigger than expected. By the time the video reaches its conclusion, it doesn't try to force an answer. Instead, it leaves the viewer with a question that lingers long after it ends. How many people were truly unstable, and how many were simply inconvenient? The narrator reframes everything that came before, encouraging the audience to reconsider the stories they've heard in the past. Because if even a fraction of these patterns are real, then the implications go far beyond individual careers. It suggests that influence isn't just about success, it's about control, about deciding who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who gets quietly removed from the conversation. And the most unsettling part is how invisible that process can be when it's done effectively. The video closes not with certainty, but with doubt. And that doubt is what keeps the viewer thinking, replaying the details, and questioning whether what they've always accepted might only be part of a much larger story.